You have found the Reflection Podcast, and this is produced by St. Matthew Lutheran in Hawthorne Woods, Illinois. You can go to our website at stmats.net to find out more about us, and I'll have some more information at the end of today's episode. On the Reflection Podcast, I have conversations with people who are uniquely gifted by God to reflect His light and His love in this very dark world. And the reason I do that is so that you can be inspired and find out how God wants to use you to reflect His light and love. So let's get to it and see who's in the pastor's office with me today on this episode of the Reflection Podcast.
In the pastor's office with me today is Brian Davies, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. Brian and I have known each other quite a while, a couple of years now. We serve in the same area as pastors in the church, but I wanted to bring you on because you have a new book coming out, and I want to talk about the book. But first, I want to talk a little bit about you.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of a biography of Brian Davies.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. It's awesome to be in your office. It's a great space.
Thank you.
I grew up in upstate New York. Did you know that?
I did.
Okay, yeah, I grew up in upstate New York. Upstate New York is not a hotbed for Lutheranism.
No.
And in fact, Outreach magazine rated that part of the country a couple years ago as the second most kind of secular thinking pocket of the United States. So that was kind of like the environment that I grew up in, where I was a part of a church, and a super healthy church with a phenomenal pastor. It was a huge part of our family's identity. But I had a lot of non-Christian friends. And so, in fact, like me and my other friend who went to the church, we were kind of some of the kids that went to church. You know, it was just like, that's kind of the culture where we found ourselves. So I grew up there in upstate New York. A mom and dad thankfully kind of introduced me to who the Lord was, a church family that was patient with me as a middle school boy in confirmation, a wonderful pastor. And growing up there, probably into high school, started to realize, man, I loved baseball, but had a hard time hitting a curveball, like many do. And I'm like, where is this going? You know, I started to really examine what parts of my life are things that I can count on that are never really going to fail me. And I came back to my faith. That's when really that kind of junior or high school or so kind of really clicked. Like, this is who I really am, and this is who I want to be. This is what I invest my life in. So then came out to Concordia University in Chicago, met my wife, now wife. We were students there, graduated there, went to Concordia St. Louis, had a great experience there. You know, windy ministry road leads you to where you are now. And so now I serve at Lord of Glory Lutheran Church in Grays Lake. I've been serving there for about 15 years now, which sounds so crazy to say. But it feels great. I love our community where we live. I love the folks who call Lord of Glory their home. Serving that church is very inspiring because it is the congregation's DNA that we exist to be a light to our community. And so I do that as best as I can, but our people do that in amazing ways. And it's inspiring to be a pastor, isn't it?
Can be, yeah.
And challenging sometimes.
That's right.
But it's very inspiring to see people like living out their faith and seeking to serve their community and seeking to be light. And that inspires me to be the best pastor I can be.
Who was it that really you could point to that I'm a pastor because of this person?
My home pastor, my really good friend growing up, it was his dad. So I was in their home a lot. I got to see who he was, what he did, how he loved people so well. I saw what he meant for our family, like how much my parents were impacted by him, how much he was so good to my grandmother who lived with us. So I got to see him take care of her as she was elderly and did her funeral, and then saw him. I'm like, that's amazing to be a part of people's lives like that.
It really is. Some people think pastor that the only thing they see of them is up in the front.
Yeah.
On a Sunday morning, but we do things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very little part of what we do, actually.
Actually, it is. Actually,
right?
It's amazing how little a part of it is.
Yeah.
I'm often fond of saying that ministry doesn't happen in the office, but really also ministry doesn't happen in the church.
Mm-hmm.
The church is actually the safe haven,
Yeah.
and then we get to go out into the world.
Yep.
and
Absolutely.
be able to. And I know that you do that as in addition to your duties as a pastor, you also have a community duty, don't you?
Yeah, I serve the Grays Lake Fire District and the Round Lake Fire Protection District as the chaplain. So that is a unique vocation, one that I never thought I would do, but the Lord ordained for me to step into that role. And it's a challenging role. In that role, I serve both the members of the fire departments themselves and their families, like providing care, support, love for them, letting them know someone's in their corner, but then also serve alongside them as they serve the community. So if they arrive on a scene that's very difficult, and for instance, if there's a house fire and they need someone to just be physically with the family, I'll do that. Or if a family experiences a sudden loss and they need someone to be there to just provide care and support for them, it's a little easier to receive care from someone in like a polo or a windbreaker than it is from someone in full fire protection gear, right? So, they take care of the situation and I come in and do what we're doing, which is sit and visit, kind of seek to bring some calm and love and care to the moment.
Well, thank you for your service.
Thanks.
As we record this, it's the day after 9/11. And of course, that was 23 years ago. That really came to the forefront of what the fire
100%.
fighters do.
And just think about when the towers were struck, there was a lot of people running down the stairs.
Yep.
And there was people running up.
Yeah.
And the people that running up the stairs were those fire personnel.
Yeah, they're true heroes.
True heroes.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's, of course, we can't help as pastors, but that's what our Lord Jesus has done for us. He ran into the cross, pursued it out of love for us.
Right. That's exactly right. And so we're called to do the same.
Yeah.
That's excellent. All right. So you're a pastor, you're a fire department chaplain, and an author. Now, you have a new book out. What's the title of the book?
The book is called Captivating Conversations.
And this is your second book.
It is my second book. Subtitle, How Christians Can Regain the Lost Art of Listening.
Okay. And so listening is very much a lost art. I will admit that, because many times that I will listen into planning on what I'm going to say next instead of actually listening to understand.
Yeah.
And so I've been very, especially since I knew this interview was coming up, to learn how to do that even more. But so what inspired you to write the book first? Well, and then we'll get into what it is.
Great. Can we just go back to what you just said, by the way? Because I do address that in the book, but it's awesome that you instinctively started thinking of that. Because I started thinking about it's almost like if you're going to have a difficult conversation with a human being, you should set I know this is theoretical and you can never really do this, but almost set a ground rule. And the ground rule will be this. When you're talking, I am only going to listen to you. Then we're going to take a break. And in that time, I'm going to think about what I'm going to say next. Because what often happens, even in a difficult conversation, is as someone's sharing something with you, you're already plotting what you're saying and waiting for the pause so I can tell you what I'm going to say instead of actually listening. And that's really what the book really invites people to do. It is a lost art.
It is.
So what was your question? How did the book come to be?
Inspired it. What inspired it? Was there a certain circumstance, or maybe it's a series of circumstances that says, we got to bring this lost art back to the light?
Great question. So I started to observe probably what you've observed, what viewers and listeners have observed, which is our culture is becoming one of talking over each other and at each other, oftentimes not taking the time to actually genuinely hear and listen to one another. It seems like everyone is trying a tweet or a hot take and to win the argument. And ironically, it's not working.
Yeah.
I was just watching Bill Maher. I had two guests on talking about a hot topic issue. And I was watching them fight about it and thinking the only approach they're taking is I just need to say the same talking points over and over and louder and louder. Right. And it's not working. In fact, it only separates and creates more distance and vitriol, right? So I started to observe that it's not working. Like that approach is not working. So I started to think, well, what would work? And I started to think, well, what did Jesus do in his earthly ministry? Like, what approach did he take? And so I started to think and observe, especially as I would plan messages, like what approach does Jesus take in interpersonal relationships? And as I started to kind of piece it all together, started to realize, holy cow, if there was ever anyone who should come down to earth and just tell people what to do and what to think and kind of be over them, it was Jesus. But that's not the approach he takes. He takes the approach of sitting, listening, and asking questions. He asks over 300 questions in his earthly ministry.
Wow.
Which, we don't get the whole scope of his ministry. There's a lot of things that we don't even know. But so that's only what's recorded is some 300 questions.
Right. In 4 short books,
right.
4 Gospels, 300 questions. That's a lot of questions.
It's a lot of questions. And a lot of times where you would think, well, why would he ask that question? Like, why would he do that, right? Let me give you one quick example. Feeding of the 5,000. I think it's Mark chapter 9 is one of the moments. And you know the story. All the people are gathered around Jesus. The disciples basically just want Jesus themselves. So they say, hey, Jesus, send these people away. They're going to be hungry. We don't have enough food for them. And then Jesus asks a question. He said, well, how much do you have? How much food do you have? Which what an interesting question to ask, but that invites them to actually take inventory of what they do have, because then from that moment, he's going to do miraculous thing with it, right? But it all starts with the question.
You would think at that point too that if Jesus is asking me a question, something amazing is going to happen next.
100%, right? So then I start to think like there's something very divine about questions.
Yeah.
That's how God works. That's how he works. And what's interesting to me then is like I love it when secular culture backs itself into biblical truth. Like it does the research, not looking at the Bible, but then figuring out, oh my gosh, it's actually most effective to take that strategy. And then the Christians in the room are like, yeah, we know that's what's in the Bible. So this is actually now secular research is indicating if you want to change someone's mind, the least successful strategy is to tell them what to do or what to think. Because what happens is that often backs someone into a corner. They take a defensive posture. They say, oh, well, that's what you think, but I think differently, right? And the most successful approach is actually asking a question, right?
There is a philosophy of raising children that I heard a long time ago about the best way to get a child to come to you is not to chase the child. If you chase if you go towards the child's going to instinctively back off. But walk away.
Yeah.
Start walking backwards and the child will follow. And that's what a question is.
Yeah.
Invite somebody in.
100%.
Yeah. Your first book was about community, building community. And so I see this as a very much the next step is how do you build community is by asking questions and having conversations.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about the art of listening. How do I listen better?
Oh boy. I think one unique approach I take in the book is that instead of talking about listening skills, which I think is usually the default thing that people do, like I just need better skills. I don't really talk about listening skills. What I talk about is an attitude or a posture that you take toward every single conversation. Okay. And I define it as, remember the show, and probably still going on, CSI, CSI Miami or CSI Las Vegas. I think about it as OCI. And those are my 3 letters that I think about taking into conversations. And that's me committing to being open, being curious, and being inquisitive. And I think about I think if you take that attitude, posture, and mindset, the listening skills are just going to follow. Open means I'm actually open to what this person has to say. I think it starts with that. How many times do we actually go into conversation already having a preconceived notion about what that person's going to think or say? Oh, there's that person there. They're going to say this again, right? I actually go into it being like, I'm actually open to changing my mind about that or hearing what they have to say. Right? Then second step, being curious, which means I'm actually going to take a posture of, I think I can learn something from them. Third, being inquisitive, like, and what I'm going to do to satisfy that curiosity is I'm going to ask questions.
Drill down on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As we're talking about questions, I'm thinking about the first time God interacted with human beings. He asked a question, Adam, where are you? And he was open.
Isn't it amazing that he
just,
asked that question?
yeah. And he knew exactly.
100%.
And yet he invites into relationship. And as you said, Jesus not only asks questions, but he has conversations with people. So I want to talk about how Jesus is a master of both listening and conversation.
Yeah.
But what is a conversation? What is the art of conversation?
Yeah. So let's talk about something that you and I do a lot, Ed, which is we visit people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we visit the same people every month.
Yeah.
And I started a couple years ago, as I started kind of on this journey of kind of what led to the book, I started to rethink those visits. I used to think that those visits were, let me come and visit, let me do a check-in, but then like give them some updates on what's going on at church so they feel connected, and then bring a devotion to them, bring the Lord's Supper to them. Then I started thinking, okay, this is a 93-year-old human being. They are oozing with wisdom if I'll just sit and listen. So then I started going to these conversations, and instead of thinking like I had to bring the info to them, I started taking a posture of openness, curiosity to them. And one question I started asking, because I think all of us are seeing culture increasingly divided,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, these people lived through some pretty divided times. So I will say, like, hey, you've probably noticed culture is pretty divided right now. People are put into different camps. Do you think this is the most divided you've ever seen our country? Can you imagine the plethora of responses I get to people if I ask 15, 80 plus year old people? So that made those visits so much more interesting.
Yes. Especially the older we get, we realize what a wealth that is.
Absolutely.
That's disappearing too.
Yep.
And so let's get it in as much as possible.
Yeah. So another example, like we have a member of our church who's an athletic director at a local high school. So I would visit with him from time to time. Then I started to look, holy cow, this is a person whose vocation is much different than mine in some ways, but also kind of similar. He's got a lot of people to think about keeping happy. He's got budgets to deal with, challenges that he never thought he'd be dealing with. So then I started bringing some of my questions to him and just being open, curious, and inquisitive. And boy, those conversations got so much more interesting.
I wonder too how much that's working on his end too, drawing him closer to hopefully a relationship with Christ that's stronger and deeper.
Yeah.
Because man, talk about somebody who is in a situation or an opportunity to reflect.
Right. Right. And secular research indicates when somebody asks you a lot of questions and shows interest in you and actually genuinely listens, the same chemicals are released in the brain as when you're eating a delicious steak dinner. Like something's firing in you that says, this is good, I love this. People love talking, they love expressing, they love working through things out loud.
And to put those two things together, what some of the best conversations I've ever had has been around a meal.
Yes.
It's been over a meal. And some of the best conversations that Jesus ever had either involved a meal or was at a meal.
Something very special about those moments, because it facilitates slowing down. No one has to do anything. You can just be present and hang together.
Yeah.
Similarly with a campfire.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, especially if there's s'mores involved.
Right. Or the pastor's office. This is another great spot.
Well, I have food in here, so that's a good thing. So let's talk about Jesus. That's what we're here for, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is he the master of both of those, listening and conversation?
Luke chapter 2 records the only story we have of Jesus post-visit from the Magi and pre-launch of his public ministry. It's 12-year-old Jesus left in the temple. And Luke records that Jesus is sitting, listening, and asking questions. The Gospel of Luke concludes with the road to Emmaus, where he's not sitting, listening, and asking questions, but he's walking alongside of them, listening and asking questions. Remember, what are you guys talking about? Isn't that so funny?
Yeah.
And then they say, and then we were talking about what just happened in Jerusalem, and Jesus Christ, who is crucified, says, "What things?" I mean, if anyone knows the answer to that
Right.
question, it's Jesus.
That's right.
So from bookends, from the beginning of his ministry to the end of his ministry, he, the Lord of all wisdom, knew that if I'm going to change hearts and minds and draw them to me as their Messiah, it's not going to be me simply telling them. It's going to be me asking questions that lead them on the road to self-discovery.
That's awesome that Jesus would do that. I mean, we do have records of Jesus in like the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, where he may have preached,
Correct.
but it's the interactions
Correct.
that are so meaningful. I mean, the things that you remember, the stories that Jesus told, the prodigal, the lost son, or the prodigal son, or the parable of the Good Samaritan. These were stories about conversations that people had.
That's right.
Yeah, that's incredible. And as we go through the life of Jesus, the last thing he said is, "I'm coming back." And then John, in the Revelation, talks about his coming back and what's going to be happening. There's going to be a meal, and we got a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
We're going to need an eternity to talk about it. So you put this book, you write all this book out, and you publish it. Now, who's going to read this, or who do you want to read this book?
Good question. I hope that Christians read the book,
Okay.
because I think that one challenge that we're up against is oftentimes Christian discipleship means I go to church and I listen to a professional Christian like you talk at them for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 25, I don't know. And the message that's subtly communicated to Christians is that this is what it means to be a Christian, is that you tell other people what to do and think.
Right.
So I am personally, like you, Ed, passionate that we want to populate heaven as much as possible. We want to see as many people come to faith. I hope to invite Christians to rethink their strategy with non-Christians.
Okay.
That primarily your job is not to tell people what to do or think, but actually to sit, listen, and ask really good questions. That's going to be the primary approach that Jesus took, and if he took it, we should take it too.
That's a great point, because so often we fall into the trap, maybe as pastors, but also as maybe lifelong Christians, is that we tend to, even though we know Jesus didn't say it, we tend to hear him say, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you more work to do." And it's not, he says, rest. And how do we rest? We sit on the couch, we sit around the fire, and we talk.
Yeah.
We have this conversation. I'm almost tempted to say no one was ever converted in a church service. Now, of course, that's not true.
Yeah.
Because the gospel does all the work, no matter what the situation. But more and more people, I think, today in 21st century world, not just America, but in the world, it's going to be these one-on-one relationship building conversations where people are going to learn more about Jesus than they'll ever learn just by sitting in front of a professional speaker. So you want Christians to read the book, but of course you want everybody to read the book.
That's right.
Yeah, that's why we write these books. But so they're getting out of this book not just learning maybe something about listening and conversation. What's the action point? What do you want them to do with it?
Yeah, and so back to that first question, because I kind of gave you part one.
Right.
Part two, of course, is I hope non-Christians read the book.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, and kind of like the story I'll tell to people who aren't a part of a church is like, hey, pick it up, because I think you're going to benefit even if you just read the second half of the book, which is kind of like mindset, attitudes, practical stuff about listening well, right? And then, in fact, I put in the book originally in the introduction, hey, if you want to skip the front part, the Jesus part, and just go right to the practical skills part, and then kind of backfill it with, oh, Jesus did that too. But my publisher was like, yeah, Brian, you can't in your book tell people to skip the Jesus part. And I'm like, okay, I get it, right? But I think non-Christians, people who don't have an active faith in Jesus Christ or aren't sure what to make of Jesus, would be curious to read the parts that just describe, hey, what does it look like to have a really good conversation with somebody? What does it look like, and I address this in the book, to listen well in the midst of conflict? What does it look like to listen well when you're interacting with someone who's grieving? There's some real practical skills in it. But then I think hopefully they'll read the Jesus part, which is, oh my goodness, the very best strategy for humankind to strengthen relationships and be invited to rethink differently was actually employed first by Jesus Christ.
When you were going through this process and you had an audience in mind, uh, what could you draw upon in your own ministry that you could pour into this book? I guess the question is, what parts of your ministry inspired you
Yeah.
to be able to do this?
Yeah. I started to, as I go back to the journey that I described to you a few minutes ago, of kind of surveying the landscape and rethinking the approach I was taking to shut in visits. I would almost do it in every aspect of my life. I started to do it more in church meetings. Like,
there's a
right? Instead of giving my opinion in order to win an argument, it's a lot better approach to ask a question of the person who's giving that opinion that seems to be in conflict with you. To be like, really, I don't exactly know what the question would be, because I don't know what the conflict would be, but really it's getting to, what is it in your personal history or understanding that leads you to have that opinion, right? Like, what's underneath the thing that's over it, right? Then I even started doing it with, I'd be at school picking up my kid. How much better is it to talk about something meaningful than talk about the Bears or the White Sox or whatever, right?
That's right.
It's so much better to be like, hey, tell me something's going great in your life right now.
Right.
What's bringing you joy these days? What's it like to be you these days? I started asking that question more, and it just I noticed, man, these conversations are a lot better when you bring some intentionality and thoughtfulness to it, when you bring some openness and curiosity to it. You learn as a human. I learn a lot more through those conversations.
Yeah, it's not a to-do list.
Yeah.
Right? I've heard that before about with your kids when you pick them up from school. Don't ask them questions that can be answered in one word.
Yeah.
Draw out that, and they will engage. The best teachers are the ones that do that. I did have a teacher once tell me that when you're thinking about and you're talking about and investigating some topic or whatever it is, look for the question behind the question. And I wonder how much our meetings, because we as pastors we spend an awful lot of time in meetings, and we don't like it. We love the people, but maybe this is a true confession for me, is that I don't like the meetings because I've forgotten that there are people at the meetings. It's not an agenda. And we're not there because of an agenda. I'm there because I get to spend time with these 8 gentlemen, or this group of people that the topic may be finances, but I get to spend time with them. And that might change the scope of our meetings a little bit, or maybe a lot. And maybe I would like to go to meetings, and I look forward to them, because you and I just got done with a meeting this morning with a group of pastors, and I remember that it was a couple of years into ministry that I looked forward to those times together, because I could listen to other brothers, other men that they're kind of like me. They're in the same job, so to speak, but they're also in different situations, and I can listen. We listen to a lot of stories today of guys around our area that are pastors, and I know I'm learning. And even though I've been at this for almost 30 years, I still learn from the guys that have been at it for 50 years. We do have a brother in the group that's been at this for a long, long time. So let's go into the weeds a little bit about the writing process.
Sure.
I'm sure there are people that are watching that maybe I've got a book in me. So tell me a little bit about your process and how it shaped this work.
I'd love to talk about that, because it's like podcasts like this that I gained a lot of information about that. I'd love to address that, but can I rewind for 10 seconds?
Absolutely.
You brought up parenting.
Yes, I did.
And I think probably a lot of our viewers are parents or grandparents, right? And this is a topic where I felt like I had some growth to experience, and still do, because as a parent, you want to shape your kid. As a grandparent, you want to shape your grandkid. So instinctively, your thought is, well, let me tell them what to do. If we're really going to take a cue from Jesus, it's actually going to be the opposite. It's going to be, kid is struggling with something. Do not tell them what to do, because actually young people don't always respond and do what you tell them to do, right? Just like adults. Let me give you one quick example. And I'm still learning at this, but this is one that worked. All right. My oldest kid relayed to me a story of one of her friends didn't make a team that she wanted to make.
Okay.
And she didn't exactly know what to say or what to do about that. Instinctively, I so badly wanted to tell her what to do or say. And I caught myself. And then I said this: Kate, what would you want someone to say to you if you were in that situation? And she kind of like backtracked, thought about it for a little bit, and then came back with something that was way better than I could have ever said, because it's perfect for what a 16-year-old needed to hear. Any answer I would have given would have been perfect for an adult telling an adult what to do. And I just thought, there's so much power in this moment, that like she came to a much better solution on her own than anything I would have told her.
Yeah, we shortchange ourselves. We short sell ourselves, is that we actually can come up with this because the Holy Spirit is
That's right.
inspiring us all over the place.
Yeah.
That's
all right, let's
great.
talk about writing process.
All right, go ahead.
So here, let's backtrack a little bit. So in long car rides with my wife, I started talking about some things that I don't get a chance to talk about on a Sunday morning. And that led her to say, Brian, you have to write this stuff down. Like, this is in you, right? So the first I would say is how great it was to have an encourager in my life. That was my wife. Like, sometimes we need people to see things in us that we can't see in ourselves. So let me tell you, I never woke up and said, do you know what this world needs? This world needs a book from Brian Davies. I never said that. I would never have written any books without my wife encouraging me. And so first book then became Connected to Christ, Overcoming Isolation Through Community, which was very timely in the 2020, 2021 era. This, to your point, Ed, then was like, how can we drill down into having better community and experiencing it better, which would be like, how do we listen better, and how do we take the approach Jesus takes? Writing a book is challenging. Holy cow. But I would just say some of the best advice I got was the language that she used was dragging yourself to the computer. You got to think of it as like dragging your dead carcass to the gym. Like, sometimes we don't want to go to the gym, but when we get there, we're like, all right, this is good. This is what I needed to do.
Yes.
In the same way, like, you just got to you just got to do it. You got to get after it, and flesh out in a way that, like, don't worry, don't write in such a way that you're writing then editing, because you're never going to make the process go. You just got to like pick up where you left off last time and just keep going. Then like kind of holistically look at it at the end and see what needs to be edited. Because what the mistake I made was, all right, I'd write, maybe 2,000 words. Wake up the next day, I'd start by reading what I wrote last time and start hacking at that and cleaning that up. And I never made any progress. Really good advice to say, hey, you can look at it like contextually, like, hey, where was I? But don't fine tooth comb that, because you'll end up scalpeling that. Just start, keep going, and that's how you get to where you need to get to.
I had somebody also very similar advice on writing is don't edit while you write. Don't worry about spelling.
Yep.
Don't worry about punctuation. Don't worry about capitalization. Just
get it
keep
out.
Writing.
Yeah, get it out.
Because I do that. I used to write my sermons out.
Yeah.
I didn't write them on hand, but I wrote them on computer. But I would go back and edit.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is taking forever.
Exactly. The other thing I would say would be sometimes in like a digital world, we can start to think like, who's even going to read this book, right? Do people even read books anymore? Right. But I would say that, like, what's really cool is what you're doing, Ed, with this podcast, like, this throwing seed. Yeah. Like, that's up to the Lord to do with it what he wants. And, like, if only a small group of people read the book, but end up having a much better conversation or share the gospel with somebody because they took a different approach, wouldn't that be worth it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like if people are encouraged because they listen to a podcast and you've had really good guests on, I've benefited from them. Like if that changes, just shifts a mindset
Right.
somewhere, it's worth it. So like I would encourage people, don't a lot of us struggle with imposter syndrome. Like, who am I? Right. And of course I feel that way. Like, who am I to write a book? I pastor a medium sized church. I'm a dad. I'm a chaplain. I got no business writing a book. But the reality is, like, some people were blessed by my first book. Thanks be to God. Right. And like, I believe that there's content that is helpful in this second book. So, like, my encouragement would be if you've got something stirring up in you, let it go.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, don't let it go, like, let it go, like, don't do anything with it. I mean, like, give it energy, give
Yeah.
it thought, like, start a podcast, write a book, do something.
That's right. There's a lot of outlets
Yes.
these days, and there's a lot of people taking advantage of those outlets.
Absolutely.
But there, if one person sees that and is changed, or the Holy Spirit changes them through it, it was absolutely worth it. Absolutely worth it. Um, the book hasn't been published as we record yet, so I can't get a copy of it. But do you have a favorite part of the book? Sometimes I ask authors to read their favorite parts out, but you know, what was the best part of writing? You know, what section did you really like?
Well, let me answer that in two ways.
Okay.
Number one, not a lot of people have interacted with the writing yet, other than my editor and stuff. But the feedback I got from some of the people that read it was I addressed listening during times of grieving, like how to be a listener to someone who's grieving. And they commented, Brian, this was a really good chapter. And it was like probably the chapter I wrote the fastest, to be honest. But I learned a lot from help I got. I had a really good series of conversations with a grief counselor. I lost my dad 11 years ago and realized that was I didn't properly grieve that loss, and kind of ended up informally talking to her about it. And she taught me a lot about grief in that moment. And so with her permission, I put a lot of that content into my book. And I think it was new information for the managing editor that read the book. So I think that's the last chapter of the book. I think that people are going to find that helpful. I also give people an acronym for listening when you're in actually the moment, or someone's sharing a difficult thing with you. Maybe you've heard it, Ed, but it's just simply READ, READ, and it's reflect, meaning like you reflect back to the person until they are like sold out. Yes, you get it. You know what I mean? So like you're telling me that, hey, my spouse just lost my job. You know, you would then reflect back based on what you've heard. It sounds like that this is what happened and this is what makes it most difficult, right? And like, yes, exactly. That you got it, right? E stands for emotion, meaning you're going to nail the emotion of it. Like, sounds like you're really afraid. That's bringing a lot of fear to you about the future. The A means you affirm something in them, right? Like, well, let me just tell you, it sounds like you're really they're seeking wisdom in this moment. That's a really good thing. But then the D part is the disclose, which is the, hey, if you're open to some feedback, do you mind if I share it with you? Right. And that's, of course, some people may be like, no, I don't really want to hear anything more right now. I'm kind of done. Okay, fine. That's fine. Then we just did REA. That's great. Hopefully this is helpful. But if you can get their permission to share feedback, they're much more open. They've already said yes to it, right? And I think the reason that strategy is so helpful is that instinctively, when people present a challenge, human nature is let's go to disclose. Let me tell you what to do or what to think or what I learned along the way, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's helpful.
I learned a long time ago when I first started as a pastor with premarital counseling. You know, how do we help couples become married? You know, in the marriage, and active listening skills is one of the sections that we learned about. And that, as you're saying, with the acronym of with the R, it's like, yeah, I hear you saying, you know, repeat back to them what they just said. That's so important in spousal relationships.
Yeah.
Is that you don't just listen to, you know, to teach, you listen to interact.
Yeah.
And too often, like you said, we put the D in the front.
Yes.
That should be the last thing we do.
That's right.
But if we can get the D to say, yes, and now you have a relationship.
That's right.
So your next book is going to be about relationships. I'm hoping.
One thing at a time.
Yeah, I get it. So, who's publishing the book? How can we get the book?
Yeah, Concordia Publishing House put it out. Shout out, word of affirmation to them. They're doing great work. They're putting out good products. They're really seeking to identify the needs that exist in culture and to meet them with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So they do very professional work. I'm really honored to work with them, frankly. And but cph.org is a great place to
Okay.
get it. But then, of course, they work with Amazon to distribute
Oh,
it.
good.
But to me, if you're watching this and you're a part of our Lutheran tribe, when you purchase things from CPH, it's just for a lot of reasons, financial and other reasons. When we support CPH, buying through CPH, it's a lot better.
Sure. That it sparked in me too when you mentioned Concordia Publishing House, because this podcast reaches non-Lutherans, which is amazing to me to begin with.
Yeah.
But they may not know what Concordia Publishing House is. It is the publishing house of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod,
Yeah.
which is nearly 2 million people strong in the United States and has been around for a long time. We do a lot of things through CPH, our publishing house. Now I need to get somebody from Concordia Publishing House on the podcast
There you
to
go.
talk about the history of that. I just finished up a real quick story. In a sermon series, I told people, because something I learned about when the Pilgrims first came to the United States, first thing they did was establish, they built houses, but then they established schools. Why? Because they wanted to teach their children how to read the Bible.
Wow.
And interpret it for themselves, which is a very Protestant Reformation type of thing as well.
Yeah.
Is that, we want our children to be able to read, and the publishing house, of course, publishes books and a curriculum and all kinds of different things. And it's just a matter of why. What was it about the Bible that taught people how to read? Because it was about a relationship that we have with our God, who loves us so much to give us this, and he listens to us. The Psalms, I'm sure you're very, very familiar with the book of Psalms, is about a conversation that most of them about David has with God.
Yeah.
And listens. And when you look at the Epistle of James, it talks about, listen twice as much as you speak.
Yeah.
Right? Be slow to speak.
Yeah.
Quick to listen.
Yeah.
And since we have 2 ears in one mouth,
Yeah.
listen twice as much as you speak. I love it. So after they pick up Captivating Conversations, books that you would recommend for someone that's read it now, what kind of books are you recommending these days?
I would recommend that it's probably the best book I've read in the last 5 years. It's Adam Grant's book, Think Again. He writes a book basically talking about, from a completely secular lens, how does transformation happen? How do people actually change their mind? Which was part of my journey to observe then how Jesus puts this into practice. But of course, he talks a lot about inviting people to rethink their positions on things through the art of asking really good questions. So I think if you read my book, then you read Adam Grant's book, you would see how I was inspired by that, and also how he has the research about, he talks about things like vaccine hesitancy in human beings. Like if there's a part of the culture that's vaccine hesitant, how do they experience a breakthrough? And he traces how the medical community tried this approach and tried this approach. And if you just present them enough information, if you just walk them through the dangers of not doing it, none of that worked to those who are vaccine hesitant. But actually, they looked at something radically different and kind of, I'll save it for the book, but kind of backfills into what I'm talking about.
Okay. Any other ones?
I'd start there and then we'd see.
That's very good now. Well, we reached the end of our time. That's kind of where I was leading us with that too. So thank you for having this conversation.
Ed, thanks for your work. You're doing a great job of putting awesome voices that you've had on before me out there.
I just fill the seat you're in right now.
Yeah.
Man. Thank you, my brother, and God's blessings to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. If you'd like to find out more, there are links in the show notes. And the Reflection Podcast is all about helping you to learn more about reflecting God's light and love. God loves you so much, and He sent Jesus to be your Savior. And now, in the followers of Jesus, God is reflected in this dark world. And the more that you reflect His love, the more people will know the love and the salvation of Jesus Christ. That's why we exist as a podcast. And your subscribing to the podcast, rating and reviewing it, leaving comments, helps push us out to more and more people so that they can know more about God and His light and love. Share this episode across your socials. That helps us get to more and more people as well. The Reflection Podcast is produced by St. Matthew Lutheran Church and Early Childhood Center in Hawthorne Woods, Illinois. To find out more about St. Matthew and our Early Childhood Center, our preschool, and our youth ministry and our worship services, you can go to our website at www.stmatts.net. That's basically just stmats.net. All our worship services are live streamed. Many of our Bible studies are, but you can also join us in person. We are in the northeast part of Illinois, just about an hour northwest of downtown Chicago and almost less than an hour from O'Hare Airport. So if you find yourself in this neck of the woods, we'd love to see you. I hope that you will join me again next time for this podcast. Go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. There's some wonderful guests in the last 3 seasons and a lot more wonderful guests coming up in the next episodes. So subscribe and stay tuned. I pray that God will richly bless you. Thank you again for joining me today, and I'll see you next time on the Reflection Podcast.